Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a 1/16 scale tutorial video on how to fabricate a late production Tiger 1 track removal cable for a 1/16 scale Tiger 1 tank. And here are the mounts at the beginning of their journey in their raw material format. Now, it is at this point I want to mention that many of the techniques that are going to be showcased in this video are considered to be advanced, and someone that is more on the novice end is going to have a hard time trying to incorporate some of these techniques if they do not have a certain skill set or some of the tooling that I'm going to be showcasing. Some of the tooling that's going to be required are a set of aviation snips, a wire cutter, a very small pair of needle nose pliers, a soldering iron, a spool of very thin gauge electrical solder, some sandpaper, some soldering flux, a heat gun, and not going to be showcased is that of a bench grinder. For material, the strips that you see here are fabricated out of thin gauge galvanized sheet steel. This type of metal is found in home improvement stores in the HVAC ductwork aisle. In lieu of the sheet metal, you can also use thin strips of brass and copper. Strips of aluminum cannot be utilized because aluminum is not a solderable metal, and for this type of application here, you will need to be utilizing a soldering iron. Now, if you are working with a shoestring budget, you can substitute the brass and the sheet metal for the strips with that of soup cans or even tomato sauce cans. The metal is more than adequate enough for doing the application at hand. Now, for the angle brass that we have here, these are actually Kns Brass Angle. Here I have a old strip that I had found in my metal bin. I'm not sure at the size or the stock number per se, but I want to say that the pieces are about 1/8 of an inch in width on each side. You will also be utilizing some wire brads, like I have here. The stock Taigen or Henlong plastic tow cable will also be required for this procedure, as well as some heat shrink tubing, which is about, again, 1/8 of an inch, and a spool of picture frame cable. Now, the whole reason why I'm going through this entire conversion process to begin with has to do with the build that I'm doing. The tank that I am building is a late production German Tiger 1, and because of which the side track removal cable needs to be changed from the kit original. I have the kit original component right here in my hand. Now, this one here is a Taigen, however the Henlong also utilizes the exact same component, and this again can be traced back all the way to the Tamiya, which the Henlong tank basically just copied. Now, the Taigen unit is decently rendered, however it is that of an early production German Tiger 1. Towards the mid and later production units, the design was changed from this format to a slightly different format for the cable's orientation. The best way to illustrate that is on the iPad I have here. Here you can see the differences between the early and the later pattern. Now, this resource here, which I'll have the link in the video description, is a fantastic source in order to judge on how many of these clips need to be fabricated, and most importantly, their actual location once mounted to the vehicle. You can use the side skirts here. You can use the side skirts here as a way to gauge out where these components go in both their length as well as their vertical orientation. But here you can see exactly how different the mounting system for the late pattern is compared to the early. Starting with the vertical straps, these are going to be the first bits of equipment I'm going to fabricate. There are 8 of these units total, and these are going to be fabricated out of the thin strips of steel that I have here. Now, in order to cut the steel, this was done with the aviation snips, and the purpose of the bench grinder, like I mentioned before, has to do with smoothing out the cuts that the tin snips usually leave behind. Aviation snips, once cut, will leave a little bit of a jagged pattern on the edges that were trimmed, and with the bench grinder you run it up and down on the edges, and that smooths everything out in a very quick manner. You can also use the bench grinder to adjust the width to give it a more uniform width, because cutting it freehand can be a little bit problematic. Now, where the wire brads come into effect with this procedure has to do with the way the straps need to be mounted to the vehicle. Because of the tension and the type of forces that are going to be found on the cable once it's spooled up into its location, adhesives alone are just not going to be enough to keep everything at bay. The best way to get the most amount of strength is by utilizing a procedure which is very similar in design to the way it's done on the 1/6 scale counterparts. And that is with a metal stem, and the piece needs to be directly hard mounted to it. Now, unlike the larger builds where I usually drill a hole into the piece of metal and then run the fastener through, with the smaller scale and with the type of tension that's going to be exhibited by the cable in question, that's not really necessary. However, in order to keep the strip of steel permanently connected to the wire brad, this will be done with solder. Now that the soldering iron is fully heated up, I'm going to go ahead and solder the piece directly to the wire brad. First, to do that, I'm going to take a little swipe of soldering flux, smear it on the tip of the wire brad, and also I'm going to have a little bit, of course, on the portion of the strip that's going to be soldered. Now, with some sandpaper, you can scuff up the section on both the nail and on the steel strip. This will give slightly better adherence, and was also done prior to the filming of this take. Also, because of the small size of these components, this is why the fine, thinner gauge solder is definitely preferable. With the thinner gauge, this allows you more pinpoint precision when it comes to soldering, as opposed to a thicker gauge, which takes a little bit longer to heat up and might give you a little bit of an extra overflow of solder on the piece, making it a little bit clunkier. You want to have just enough to firmly and permanently attach the steel strip to the nail, but not too much where it becomes an issue when it comes to mounting to the vehicle. Have the iron. Just going to add a little drop of solder to the piece. And I'm going to go ahead and solder the piece directly to it. After a few seconds, the solder will cool down, and the strip is now permanently attached to the wire brad. Once the piece is soldered on, it's then time to actually form the shape of the mounting bracket. This is, of course, done with the plier. And I bend the steel into a U-shaped strap that we have here. Now, this size strap here is going to be used for the main connecting points, which are along the top. The two on the ends, which by the way are also probably just as important, if not more important than the main ones, are going to be slightly shorter in shape due to the fact the way the cable needs to bend around. Having them this long is really not that necessary. With the tin snips, I was able to trim off the remainder of the metal, and this bracket here is now completed. And I can now repeat the exact same step for the other brackets that are remaining. The only thing to keep in mind is that when fabricating the other units, you want to bend and shape them as close as possible to this sample one that I have here, so that all of the components are uniformed in shape and size and do not stick out and blend in very well once they are mounted to the vehicle. Once the main straps are all done, it's then time to make the actual endpoints for the tow cable eyes. Now, there are two patterns that are going to be used on this tank. The first is the non-adjustable length, and the other version is to mimic that of the adjustable one. The non-adjustable one is comprised out of a piece of angle brass, and this one here will have one of the wire brads soldered to the end, and it'll have a second wire brad, only a little bit shorter, soldered to the top. The longer version is to connect this to the tank's side hull, and the shorter one is going to be the point where the tow cable eye then connects to this component. To mount this on, of course, it's going to be soldered. Now, because of the smaller size, you want to use a pair of pliers because the heat will definitely burn you when it comes time to mounting this to the tank, or I should say to the wire brad. Same thing can also be said to the thin sheet metal that I was using before. As the strip gets shorter and shorter, the chances of you burning your hands go up. So the shorter it gets, you definitely want, it will behoove you to switch to a plier type device. Same type of procedure for the soldering with the flux. Once the mounting section is done, it's then time to add the second one. Now you have to be careful when it comes to soldering this, because since the whole piece of brass will get heated from the iron, the solder joint here is going to melt and the piece is just going to crumble on you. In order to prevent that, this is why you need a very good vise like the one I have here. The vice's jaws act as a heat sink and will draw away the heat away from the wire brad, which will prevent it from melting away. The point that you want to solder on will be able to adhere and cool down before this section here begins to heat up. And here's the piece now gripped into the jaws. Now the jaws are not making contact with the wire brad, they're actually connected to the brass. Now when it comes time for the jaws to act as a heat sink, you don't want to have the piece completely up against the jaws, as this will then absorb too much heat and you won't be able to get the second wire brad to adhere on in a strong manner. You want to have it just slightly above the jaws so there's enough material for it to warm up and for the solder to adhere to, but not too much so that the secondary wire brad begins to get weak and fall off. It's a tricky procedure, but is one that once you get a little bit of practice, you can easily overcome. It might take a couple attempts, but it's definitely doable. Now, one thing about this type of thing is that if you do screw up, the piece is not garbage. You just heat it up again, polish it off with some sandpaper, and you can start again without having to cut any more brass. And here we have the second wire brad now shortened and ready for soldering. You'll notice I went ahead and shortened it considerably compared to the way it was originally. This is the appropriate length for the scale that I'm working in. Also keep in mind this has to be just long enough for the tow cable cleat to clip onto. Now the piece was snipped with the wire cutter that I mentioned before, and you notice the bottom is still jagged from the snipping. This is okay to leave it like this because with this type of cut, this will actually help the solder to goop inside and to solidify, actually make it stronger than if it was sand away flush. Just a little drop of flux on both of the parts. Then I could go ahead and solder it. And here's the piece now completed. Once this piece is done, you can then do the exact same procedure to the other version of the mounting stanchion. Now for the second mounting stanchion, you'll notice it's a lot longer compared to the one that I just completed. That's because on the real Tiger 1, this piece here is actually adjustable, and the stanchion can be loosened or tightened by moving it up and down this which would be a track on the real vehicle. Now in 1/6 scale, it's actually viable to make the piece fully functional. However, in 1/16, it's really more problematic, and it's best done in a static format. Now in terms of soldering, this is going to be utilizing the exact same techniques that I just showcased before. Now for the mounting bracket, the portion that's going to plug into the actual model, I like to solder it in the dead center of the piece. And just like last time, once the main mount is done, it's then time for the second. Now for this one here, you are allowed a little bit of artistic licensing on where exactly along this plane to solder the second lug. Me personally, I like it all the way on the end, but again, since like the real one was adjustable, you do have some variation in which you can depict it. Okay, get some flux on that guy. Now with this guy here, I'm just going to put a little drop of solder on the brass, and then put the wire brad where it needs to be. And there we go. And here are the brackets now fully fabricated and are ready for installation. Just before I do, however, I am going to shorten the lengths of these mounting wire brads because they are far too long to be practical for mounting inside of the vehicle. And here are the same parts now mounted to the model. Now one thing to point out is that when you're doing this conversion, you are going to have to do bodywork to the side of the vehicle. The reason for that has to do with the original location of the stock Taigen or Henlock component. The brackets are different compared to the late Tiger, and because of that, the holes from the original ones are still going to be present, and you're going to have to delete them. They get deleted with basic bodywork. Now on a vehicle like this one here with the Eyelet, the bodywork is somewhat easier to do because you don't really have to sand them down. You add the putty to the holes, and then with a screwdriver or a comb, you go ahead and then add the cross lines of the Eyelet. By doing this, the pieces will then blend in with the rest of the tank's Eyelet coating. Now, the cable mounts are only half of the equation. The other half has to do with the actual tow cable itself. Now, with this conversion here, you are going to need to replace the stock plastic cable with a real detailed tow cable. For this half of the conversion, you're going to utilize the stock original tow cable, some picture frame wire, and some lengths of thin shrink tubing. From the stock original cable, the parts that are going to be of interest are the eyelets. These two components here are going to be recycled and mated to the real steel cable. Now for the cable itself, this is picture frame cable. This is the type of stuff that's found in hardware stores and is very, very affordable. I believe this spool here I picked up a few years ago for about $1 or $2. The advantage about picture frame cable is that it is a real steel cable, so it gives you the nice weave detailing. But another benefit of using this steel cable compared to some of the other steel cables out there has to do with the flexibility. Picture frame cable is very pliable and can be formed in various different shapes and manners. Why this is important has to do when it comes time to mounting the cable to the side of the tow cable mounts. With this flexible nature, this will make the job a lot easier compared to working with a more high tensile cable, which is stiffer and can cause a lot of problems. To do the cable mod, you're going to first cut off the stock eyelets from the molded plastic piece. You are then going to clip away the mounting stud and also the stock detailing, which would be the brace that we soldered together before. This is best done with either a file or a sharp hobby knife, or in this case a mini utility knife. After the pieces have been clipped and their mounting nubs have been deleted, it is then time with a Dremel to drill out the center portion in order to slide it over the mounting wire brad that I had before. Now the hole has to be drilled dead in the center, and this can be either done with a Dremel or with a small pin vise. Now if you're drilling and you remove too much material and you come out on one of the sides, this is not a problem, as then the piece can still clip onto the wire brad in this type of a format instead of it just sliding over. Once the hole is drilled out, it is then time to make the eyelet mate to the cable. Now because of the thinness of the stem that we have here, there's no way you're going to be able to drill this out to have the cable fit inside. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to have a sleeve put over the stem and the cable, and that will fuse it together, and that will become the new detailing of the stem. To do this though, you are going to have to shorten the stem by cutting it basically in half, which will now give you plenty of runway to have the two pieces connect. Otherwise it'll be far too long and will stick out like an eyesore. Do this to both units. Now, as at this point here, I can also trim the shrink tubing and shrink it to the same diameter of the steel cable. Now before I go ahead and mount the shrink tubing onto the sections, what I am going to do is a small trick that I like to do to metal cables. When it comes time to sliding things onto the end, you will always snag a small little wire that would be on the end section of where the cable was cut. This is true even if the cable is cut in a very clean way, like I have it over here. One way to prevent the fraying is I take a little bit of flux, and with a little drop of solder, I will go ahead and solder the ends of the cable. By doing this very quick procedure, this cauterizes the end and makes it one solid piece, and will prevent any sort of fraying that can happen when it comes time to sliding any sort of tube onto this section. After the cauterizing is done, I then slide on the shrink tubing, and I can then slip it over the plastic component. It is at this point here where I can go ahead and add the heat from the heat gun and shrink the tube in place. Once the shrink tubing contracts, it is going to grip onto the tow cable and onto the eyelet in a nice clean manner. Now when it comes time to doing this procedure, you have to be very careful, as you can easily overheat the plastic section and deform it and melt it. So care must be exhibited by the builder at this point here. I'm going to turn on the heat gun, and I'm going to go at a very low setting, and I'm going to briefly hit it and then let it cool off a little bit just to prevent the plastic from melting. Slow and steady wins the race on this one, and when you're done, the piece will look like this. Once the eyelet is done on one end, you need to complete the rest of the tow cable. Now this has to be done with the cable actually fitted to the tank, otherwise you run the risk of either having the cable too long or too short, neither of which is ideal. The best way to do this is to hook up one end to one of the cleats and then just go ahead with the mounting procedure. Now, one thing about these Tiger One track mounting cables is that to the casual observer, they do look a bit complicated and a bit cumbersome with their mounting format. However, there is a simple format how they get mounted on, and once you've done one or two Tigers, it basically becomes secondhand nature. The start will be at the front of the vehicle, and then I'm going to weave my way through the rest of the hooks. And here you can see why the clips being made out of metal is going to be very beneficial to the model once fully strung up. Get in there, you. There we go. You can also see why the use of a picture frame cable is going to be beneficial for this application, because of the flexibility of the cable at hand. Now, here we have the cable layout all complete, and it looks a bit cumbersome at this moment here. Keep in mind that after the tank goes into its painting and weathering, and when the cable gets mounted on permanently, what's going to happen is that I'm going to go ahead and compress these little tabs that we have here, thus keeping the cable in place in a better manner. By doing that already, you'll notice how the cable is a lot more cleaned up than the way it was before. Once fully laid out, I'm now going to take the secondary eyelet, slide it in place, and now from here I know exactly where to cut the cable so that it mates perfectly with the plastic unit. With the Sharpie, I'm going to mark exactly where the cut needs to be. Once the cable is marked, you can then clip it. Now, this material is very easily cut with a wire cutter or even a set of aviation snips. However, one bit of equipment that makes your life a hell of a lot easier for cutting this type of medium is a dedicated cable cutter. I've had this tool for many, many years now, and it's used primarily and solely for the purpose of cutting steel cables. It's nothing more than a modified set of tin snips, and these are found in hardware stores across the country. The advantage about this tool is that no matter how sharp or new a set of tin snips or even the wire cutter is, when it comes time for cutting cable, you will always have some fraying going on at the very end. With this tool, however, that's really not the case. I'm going to go ahead, cut the tool on screen, or cut the cable on screen so you see exactly what I'm referring to. As you can see, it made very short work of the cable, and the cable cut is nice and precise. It is at this point now where I can do the solder technique that I did before, as well as the heat shrink tubing technique. With those two techniques out of the way, you will then have the cable fully completed. One more thing to mention was that even after the shrink tubing is secured in place, the piece can possibly still slide out like I did here. If this happens, it's no big deal. With a little drop of super glue, you add it onto the center section, and then you just simply insert it back into the sleeve that it fell out of. Since the shrink tubing is molded around the circumference of the plastic, it should just sit back in a nice snug manner. And here's the cable now fully painted, weathered, and permanently mounted to the completed vehicle. And with that, that wraps up this 1/16 scale tutorial video. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where you can get updates on new model showcase, project update videos, and even tutorial videos when they get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more pictures of this particular tank that I have here that was used in this video, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on the channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.